The nurse placed my daughter on my chest, still slick and warm, and crying that thin, furious newborn cry, and I looked up, already smiling, already turning to share this with the person who was supposed to be standing right beside me. But the space beside my bed was empty. To understand why my husband wasn't there in the first minutes of our daughter's life, you have to go back almost a year, to a version of our marriage that had already started emptying out long before I ever went into labor. My name isn't important here. What matters is that my husband's name is Mark, and when I met him, he was warm in a way that felt almost old-fashioned, the kind of man who opened car doors and remembered small details from conversations weeks earlier. We dated for 2 years before we got married, and for most of that time, I would have told you, without hesitation, that I'd found someone genuinely good. I want to hold on to that memory even now, because I think it's important to say that the man I fell in love with was real. He just didn't stay. The shift started so gradually that for a long time I couldn't have told you exactly when it began. If you'd asked me 6 months into my pregnancy whether something was wrong, I would have said no, we're just adjusting. Every couple goes through this. That's the thing about a slow unraveling. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, one small absence at a time, until one day you look up and realize the person across from you has been gone for a while, and you simply hadn't noticed the exact moment he left. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday morning, and I remember running into the living room where Mark was getting ready for work, holding the test out to him with hands that were shaking from excitement rather than nerves. He hugged me. He said all the right things. But I remember, even in that moment, a flicker of something crossing his face before the smile settled into place. Something that looked almost like calculation, like he was doing quick math on what this meant for the life he'd pictured for himself. I told myself I imagined it. I wanted to have imagined it so badly that I simply decided I had. The first trimester was hard in ordinary ways. The exhaustion, the nausea, the general disorientation of a body doing something entirely new. Mark was attentive in those early weeks, or attentive enough that I didn't think to question it, bringing home ginger ale, taking over dishes when the smell of food made me sick. But somewhere around the start of the second trimester, once the pregnancy became visible, once it became undeniable and permanent rather than an early secret the two of us shared, something in him started to recede. He started working later. Not dramatically later at first, just an extra hour here, an extra hour there, always with a reasonable explanation attached. A project at work, a client who needed something urgent, a colleague who was out sick and needed coverage. I believed every explanation individually because each one, taken alone, was perfectly plausible. It was only much later, looking back at the whole pattern stretched out together, that I understood what I'd actually been watching was a man slowly building distance between himself and a life he wasn't sure he wanted. There's one conversation from that time I still think about often, one that I explained away in the moment, but that I now understand was the clearest thing he ever said to me. We were lying in bed, maybe 5 months along, and I was talking about names, about the nursery, about some article I'd read on newborn sleep schedules, the ordinary chatter of an excited, expectant mother. Mark was quiet for a long time, and then he said, not unkindly but flatly, "I didn't think it would be like this." "Like what?" I asked, still riding the momentum of my own excitement, not really hearing the weight in his voice. "I don't know," he said. "Real, I guess. It felt different when it was just an idea." I remember laughing a little, telling him that was normal, that everyone feels nervous, that he'd feel differently once she was here. I said all the things people say to smooth over a moment that scares them, and he let me say them, and neither of us brought it up again. But I understand now that he had told me something true and important in that moment, and I had simply refused to let myself hear it, because hearing it would have meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, that the man I'd married was quietly, steadily deciding he didn't want the life we were building. By the third trimester, the distance had become something I could no longer explain away with work stress alone. He missed one of our anatomy scan appointments, the one where we found out we were having a girl, because of a meeting that, when I asked about it later, seemed to have ended hours before the appointment even started. When I brought it up, gently, not accusingly, he got defensive in a way that felt disproportionate to what I'd actually said, And I remember thinking, even then, this isn't really about the appointment. I leaned more and more on my mother and my best friend Priya during those months, in ways I hadn't expected to need to. It was Priya who came with me to pick out the crib, laughing with me in the store about how overwhelming all the options were, while Mark stayed home, saying he had work to catch up on. It was my mother who sat with me for hours assembling the nursery furniture, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, while Mark walked through the room once, said it looked good, and went back to whatever he was doing on his laptop in the other room. I told myself I was lucky to have them. I was. But some small, honest part of me also understood that I was building an entire support system around a hole that Mark was supposed to be filling, and wasn't. There was a night, about 6 weeks before my due date, when I asked Mark directly if everything was okay between us. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and I remember my hands resting on top of my belly, feeling the baby shift and roll underneath them, and I asked him plainly, "Are you happy about this? About us? You feel far away lately." He looked at me for a long moment, and I remember hoping, so badly, that he would say something honest, something we could actually work with. Instead, he said, "I'm just tired. It's a lot right now. It'll be fine once she's here." And because I wanted so desperately for that to be true, because the alternative felt too frightening to sit with 8 months pregnant and mostly alone in the project of preparing for a child, I let myself believe him. I think that's the part of this story I understand most clearly now, looking back. I wasn't naive because I was foolish. I was naive because the truth was too heavy to carry, while also growing a person inside my body, and so I set it down, again and again, and picked up hope instead, because hope was lighter and easier to hold. The week before my due date, Mark seemed, if anything, slightly better. He came to the last 2 appointments. He helped me finish packing the hospital bag, even joked a little about which snacks to bring, and for a few days I let myself believe that whatever had been happening those past months truly was just stress, just nerves, exactly the kind of thing he'd said it was. I told Priya on the phone that I thought we'd turned a corner. I remember saying, almost giddy with relief, "I think once she's actually here, everything is going to click into place for him." I believed that with my whole chest. I need to say that clearly, because it matters for understanding what came next. I wasn't walking into that hospital room braced for what was about to happen. I was walking in hopeful, genuinely hopeful, certain that whatever Mark had been carrying those past months, holding his daughter for the first time, would finally set it down. My water broke at 11 at night, 3 days before my due date, while we were watching television on the couch. And I remember the strange, almost comic normalcy of the moment, both of us staring down at the couch cushion like it had personally betrayed us before scrambling into motion. Mark was, in that initial rush, exactly the man I remembered falling in love with, grabbing the hospital bag, double-checking he had the car keys, holding my hand tightly in the passenger seat while I breathed through the first real contractions on the drive to the hospital. For those first frantic hours, I let myself believe, fully and completely, that whatever distance had crept into our marriage over the past several months was about to dissolve entirely the moment our daughter arrived and made all of it real for him in the way it had already become real for me. I had no idea, sitting in that hospital bed at 2 in the morning, gripping Mark's hand through a contraction while he wiped my forehead with a wet cloth and told me I was doing great, that in less than 12 hours, that same hand would let go of mine, that he would stand in that room and look at his newborn daughter, and that something in him would choose, in that exact moment, to walk out the door instead of toward her. Labor lasted 14 hours, longer than either of us expected, and for most of it, Mark was genuinely present in a way that gave me hope I clung to hard. He held my hand through the worst of the contractions. He fed me ice chips. He told the nurses jokes to keep the mood light when things got tense around hour 10, when the baby's heart rate dipped briefly, and a small flurry of doctors came in to check monitors before things settled back to normal. I remember thinking, in the haze of exhaustion and pain, that this was the Mark I married, that whatever had happened over the past several months was truly behind us now, burned away by the sheer physical urgency of what we were going through together. She was born at 1:17 in the afternoon, after a final hour of pushing, That left me shaking and soaked and more exhausted than I'd ever been in my life. And the moment they lifted her up, that first thin, outraged cry filling the room, I remember Mark's face doing something I hadn't seen in months. He looked, for just a second, completely undone, tears in his eyes, his hand tightening around mine so hard it almost hurt. "She's here," he kept saying, like he couldn't quite believe it. "She's actually here." They placed her on my chest first, skin to skin, the way we'd planned, and I remember the nurse asking Mark if he wanted to cut the cord, and he did it with hands that were visibly shaking, and for those first several minutes, everything felt like it was supposed to feel, overwhelming and enormous and good. I looked up at him at one point, both of us crying, both of us laughing through the tears the way new parents do, and I thought, this is it. This is the moment that fixes everything. Then the nurses moved to weigh her and do the initial checks a few feet away, and in that small gap, that ordinary administrative pause in an otherwise enormous moment, I watched something in Mark's face change. It happened so fast I almost didn't register it. A kind of shutting down, like a light switching off behind his eyes. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened in a way I recognized from the past several months. That specific tension that meant something outside this room had just reached in and pulled his attention away. "Everything okay?" I asked, still riding the exhaustion and adrenaline of what had just happened. "Yeah," he said, too quickly. "Just work stuff." I remember thinking, even in that moment, work stuff. On the day our daughter was born, at 1:30 in the afternoon, and some old, tired part of me recognized the shape of the lie even before I had words for why it didn't add up. But I was exhausted, and my daughter was being placed back on my chest, wrapped now in a hospital blanket, her tiny face scrunched and furious and perfect, and I didn't have room in me in that moment to interrogate it further. The nurse asked if Mark wanted to hold her, and I looked up at him, expecting him to reach out immediately the way I'd imagined he would for the entire 9 months of this pregnancy. Instead, he hesitated, just for a second, but long enough that the nurse noticed too, her expression flickering with the smallest, most professional confusion. "I just need a minute," Mark said. "I need some air. It's a lot." I told him it was okay. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters for understanding what came next. In that moment, I genuinely believed him. New fathers get overwhelmed. I'd read about it, heard about it from friends, the way the enormity of the moment can hit some men sideways, can send them briefly out of the room to collect themselves before they're ready to hold what they've just helped create. I told him to go, to take his time, that she and I would be right there when he got back. He kissed my forehead, and he kissed the top of our daughter's head, so briefly it was almost not a kiss at all, and he walked out of the room. I held her for the next 20 minutes, alone, waiting for him to come back, telling myself he just needed a few minutes to cry somewhere private, to process the size of what had just happened. My mother arrived not long after that, having rushed from home the moment I'd texted her that labor was progressing fast, and I remember the confusion on her face when she asked where Mark was, and I said, "He just stepped out for a minute," a sentence that felt more and more absurd every time an hour passed and he still hadn't returned. By 4 o'clock, 3 hours after our daughter was born, I had called his phone 6 times. It went to voicemail every single time. I texted him, first casual, then increasingly worried, then, by the 5th text, something closer to panic. "Is everything okay? Please call me. Where are you?" The nurses started asking, gently, professionally, whether everything was all right at home, whether there was anyone else who could be with me, and I remember the humiliation of that question landing somewhere deep in my chest, because I understood, even as I brushed it off with some vague explanation about him needing air, that I was starting to sound like a woman making excuses for someone who wasn't coming back. My mother stayed. She held my daughter when I needed to sleep. She brought me food from the cafeteria. She asked me gently, more than once, if I wanted her to try calling Mark herself, and each time I said no, not yet, certain, in that particular way exhausted, hopeful people are certain that he'd walk back through that door any minute with some explanation that would make all of this make sense. He didn't come back that evening. He didn't come back that night. I lay in that hospital bed with my daughter sleeping in the bassinet beside me, checking my phone every 20 minutes, watching the screen stay dark, feeling something in my chest curdle from worry into a colder, harder feeling I didn't have a name for yet. Around midnight, a nurse doing rounds asked, carefully, whether I felt safe, whether there was any reason to be concerned for my well-being at home. A question I understood was standard protocol, but that still landed like a small, sharp confirmation of how strange and wrong this whole situation had become. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of the baby, who slept in longer stretches than I expected for a newborn, but because I kept running through every version of where Mark could be and why, and none of the explanations I could construct made any sense for a man who had just watched his daughter be born. An accident felt like the most frightening possibility, and twice I almost called the police, stopping myself each time because some instinct, some old, tired knowledge of the past several months, told me this wasn't an accident. This was a choice. He walked back into that hospital room at 9:40 the next morning, more than 20 hours after he'd said he needed a minute of air, and I looked up from where I was feeding our daughter and felt something in me go very still and very quiet, quieter than I expected anger to feel. "Where," I said, "have you been?" He stood in the doorway for a moment before he came all the way in, and I noticed he wasn't wearing the same clothes he'd left in the day before. That detail landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending out ripples of understanding I wasn't ready for yet. He looked exhausted, unshaven, his eyes rimmed red in a way that could have been crying or could have been something else entirely, and for a moment, neither of us said anything, the only sound in the room our daughter's small, contented feeding noises. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, closing the door behind him, "and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything." I didn't promise him that. I just looked at him, waiting, my daughter's small hand curled around my finger, and some part of me understood, even before he said another word, that whatever came next was going to reorganize everything I thought I understood about the past 9 months. Her name was Sarah, he told me, someone from his office, someone he'd started talking to nearly a year earlier, before I'd even gotten pregnant, when he said things between us had started to feel, in his words, routine. I want to say clearly that I'm not interested in relitigating every excuse he gave that morning, because most of it was exactly the kind of thing men say when they're trying to make an affair sound like something that happened to them, rather than something they chose. What actually mattered for understanding the past 9 months, was this. The distance I'd felt building since the second trimester hadn't been fear of fatherhood in the abstract. It had been Mark, quietly, deliberately, trying to decide between 2 lives, mine and the one he'd built in secret with Sarah, and for most of my pregnancy, he genuinely hadn't known which one he was going to choose. He told me that when he walked out of that hospital room, he hadn't been overwhelmed by joy the way I'd assumed. He'd been overwhelmed by panic, by the sudden, physical reality of a daughter who made the other life he'd been quietly building impossible to keep pretending about. He said he drove straight to Sarah's apartment, that they'd talked, or fought, or something in between, for most of the night, that he was trying, even then, even hours after his daughter's birth, to figure out which door he was going to walk through. I remember sitting there, holding our daughter, listening to my husband explain that on the day she was born, he had spent the night deciding whether he wanted to be her father at all, and feeling something in me go very cold and very clear, the same kind of clarity I imagine soldiers describe in the middle of a crisis, where the panic burns off entirely and all that's left is the next necessary step. "And what did you decide?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I'm here," he said, like that was supposed to be an answer, like showing up 20 hours late, in yesterday's clothes, after a night spent with another woman deciding whether his daughter was worth staying for, was some kind of grand romantic gesture, rather than the bare minimum arriving embarrassingly, permanently late. I didn't scream. I want to be honest about that, because I know people expect some explosive confrontation in a moment like this, and that's not what happened. I was too tired, too raw, too aware of the small, sleeping person in my arms, who needed me steady more than she needed me furious. I just looked at him and said, very calmly, "You need to leave. Not forever, not right this second in some dramatic way. But you need to go home. and you need to give me space to think, because I am not making any decisions about the rest of my life while I'm sitting in a hospital bed 40 hours after giving birth." He tried to argue, tried to explain further, tried to tell me that things with Sarah were over now, that he'd chosen us, that this was all going to be a story we'd look back on as the moment things got better. I let him talk because I didn't have the energy to stop him, but I want to be clear that somewhere in that hospital bed, holding my daughter, listening to him try to fold an affair and an abandonment into a redemption arc that centered entirely on him, I made a decision that had nothing to do with what he was saying and everything to do with what I already knew. I was not going to spend one more year of my life waiting to see whether Mark decided I was worth staying for. He left the hospital that afternoon, at my request, and I spent the rest of my stay with my mother and Priya, rotating in and out, both of them furious on my behalf, in a way I didn't have the energy to be yet myself. I remember Priya asking me, gently, what I wanted to do, and I told her the truth. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew, with total certainty, what I was never going to do again, which was build my sense of security around a man who needed 20 hours and another woman's apartment to decide whether his own daughter was worth showing up for. The weeks after we came home were some of the hardest of my life, made harder by the specific exhaustion of a newborn combined with the slow, deliberate work of ending a marriage. Mark moved out within the first month, not entirely willingly, but I made it clear that space wasn't optional, that I needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly was not something I could do with him still in the house. I want to say that the divorce process itself was straightforward, but it wasn't. Not entirely. There were weeks of him oscillating between guilt and defensiveness, between genuine remorse and moments where he tried, subtly, to suggest that I was being too harsh, that everyone makes mistakes, that plenty of marriages survive worse. What mattered most, in the end, wasn't the affair itself, painful as that was to sit with. It was the specific, undeniable fact of that first day, documented in hospital records, witnessed by nurses, remembered by my mother. A father who left minutes after his daughter's birth and didn't return for nearly a full day. When it came time to work out custody arrangements, that fact sat at the center of everything, an anchor point neither of us could argue around, and it shaped an agreement that gave me the stability and primary custody I needed to build the next chapter of our lives without constantly negotiating around a man who had already shown, in the most concrete way possible, exactly how he behaved under pressure. I built a life in the months that followed that I'm genuinely proud of, one centered around my daughter and the people who'd actually shown up for both of us. My mother, Priya, a small circle of friends who became, in practical terms, more of a family than Mark's absence ever allowed him to be. Mark did try to come back into the picture more seriously about 6 months later, once he saw, from a careful distance, that I was doing well, that our daughter was thriving, that the life I was building without him looked stable and full, in a way that maybe made him reconsider what he'd walked away from. I let him be a father to her, because that mattered more to me than any anger I still carried toward him as a husband, but I never once let him back into the role of someone I needed to stay steady. I think about that hospital room sometimes, the empty space beside my bed in the first minutes of my daughter's life, the exact shape of the absence where Mark should have been standing. I used to think that was the worst moment of the whole story, the loneliest few minutes I'd ever experienced. Now I understand it differently. That empty space beside my bed turned out to be the first clear, honest thing my marriage ever showed me, the moment the truth finally arrived faster than my hope could explain it away. And once I saw it clearly, I never needed anyone to fill that space again, except the daughter already sleeping, steady and unbothered, in my arms.